What if I told you that one of the most permanent and impactful things we do as educators is something for which we receive little to no training? My name is Bryan Corn, and I'd like to take a few minutes to talk to you about report card grades. My interest in grades began about a year ago as I was asked to serve on a committee in my district that was tasked with developing a unified set of curricular standards. We began our mission by examining grading through a book study of Ken O'Connor's A Repair Kit for Grading, 15 Fixes for Broken Grades. Reading through the book, two things became clear to me. Number one, I had never given my grading practices any truly critical thought. And number two, I had a lot to learn about how to make grades more valid. Let's start by thinking about the purpose of grading. While some researchers like Alfie Kohn would prefer that teachers abandon the practice of grading altogether, others such as Allen, Guskey and Bailey, Cross and Frary, and Marzano see some legitimate and valid reasons for giving grades. Grades help parents and students in planning post-secondary choices. Grades help administrators and counselors make decisions about student matriculation and placement of transfer students. Grades are often used when evaluating instructional and intervention programs. However, in order for any of these purposes to be well served, the grades must be valid. They must truly measure and communicate a student's academic achievement. So what's wrong with this system? Robert Marzano asserts that grades are so imprecise that they are almost meaningless. This is clearly a problem if grades are going to serve all the purposes I mentioned earlier. So why are they imprecise? What aspects of our grading practices are reducing their validity? The research on grading practices seems to point to two main reasons for the lack of validity. Number one, teachers tend to include too many factors, many of which are not achievement related, when calculating grades. This is a practice that Cross and Frary refer to as hodgepodge grading. And number two, final grades have too much subjectivity in the way that they are calculated. Let's first take a look at hodgepodge grading. If grades are intended to accurately communicate academic achievement, then factors such as behavior, effort, and attendance should not be factored in their calculation. While it may be true that these aspects of a student's performance may negatively or positively impact their academic achievement, to include them outright in calculating a grade will reduce the grade's validity. Unfortunately, doing so is a very common practice. Researcher James Allen reported that 2/3 of teachers believe that factors such as effort, behavior, and overall attitude should factor into a student's grade. Cross and Frary found that 72% of teachers had raised the grades of low-ability students based on their effort and growth. Marzano again states the point quite bluntly when he asserts that it is very possible, often likely, that two students who are in the same class and receive the same assessment scores will end up with different grades because of the inclusion of non-academic factors. Additionally, Allen, Sizek, and others point out that teachers often have complete control over which factors to include or not include in their grade calculations, making those grades more of a reflection of how well a student lives up to the teacher's expectations of what a good student is, rather than measuring and communicating their actual academic abilities. The meaning of grades becomes even more distorted when teachers control not only which academic factors are included, but also how much weight each one receives. For example, a student who attends class regularly but achieves a lower level of mastery on summative assessments may receive the same grade as a student who occasionally misses class but scores higher on assessments. Even when teachers include only academic criteria in grade calculations, the subjectivity and the weighting of the different assessments hurts the validity of their grades. In one study by Marzano, pairs of teachers were given assessment scores for a hypothetical student and asked to calculate a final grade. Only 47% of the time did the two teachers give the same grade for the student, and sometimes the grade was as much as 2 grade levels different. The difference was simply due to the various ways in which the teachers weighted the different assessments. So where did these practices come from? Most teachers simply fall back on grading practices that they themselves have experienced for 16 years or more. Many teachers defend the inclusion of non-academic factors by arguing that doing so helps to shield students from negative effects of low grades. Low grades have been shown to have a drastic negative effect on student self-esteem and can also have serious social consequences for students, such as the lack of eligibility for extracurricular activities. Some researchers, such as Cross and Frary, have argued that teachers will include non-academic factors as a way to boost grades in order to avoid the appearance of incompetence. Other teachers have argued that the idea of assessing grades runs counter to their personal educational philosophies. Researchers Covington and Teal found that teachers showed serious concern for the amount of distrust the grading process creates between students and teachers. Many teachers struggle to reconcile the act of grading with what they see as their primary responsibility, the facilitation of learning. This conflict creates cognitive dissonance for many teachers. On the one hand, we want to see our students succeed. We often get emotionally invested in their success in the classroom. However, we also recognize the responsibility that we have to assign a grade. As a result, many teachers fall into the habit of developing what Zizek calls a success orientation for their grading practices. They favor any method of calculating grades that results in the best possible outcome for their students. Perhaps the easiest explanation for why bad grading practices persist is that teachers have simply never been taught a better way, or why their way is not valid. Researchers Allen and Lambatting found that less than 1/3 of teacher preparation programs included a course on assessment and grading. In most cases, if a pre-service teacher encounters discussions about reliability and validity, they are not directly tied to classroom experiences. While Alfie Kohn advocates for the abolition of grades altogether, most teachers and researchers recognize that grades are a deeply entrenched part of the educational experience for students. So, how can we fix the system we have in place? Many of the fixes for the problem of validity in report card grades will have to take place at a level beyond the control of individual teachers. For instance, Zizek and Allen and Lambatting point out that the pre-service experiences of teachers must include more direct instruction on creating a grading system with more validity. Teacher candidates must have experience with calculating end-of-term grades prior to the beginning of their student teaching experience. They argue that the student teaching experience itself must include the development of sound grading practices, ideally with the cooperation of their cooperating teacher. Finally, the university professors that teacher candidates interact with must model sound grading practices within their own courses and classrooms in order to break the cycle of teachers' own experiences leading them towards unsound grading practices. But what about individual teachers and school districts? What can we do to try to improve our own grading practices? One of the most suggested ways of improving grading practices is to develop a multifaceted grade reporting system that communicates both academic and non-academic achievement, but through separate grades. Cross and Frary found that there is significant support for such a system among teachers they surveyed. If a single grade must be used, however, Guskey and Bailey recommended that a detailed explanation must be provided regarding what factors went into the grade's calculation. Finally, for any teacher wanting to improve their own grading practices, I highly recommend a reading of O'Connor's A Repair Kit for Grading, 15 Fixes for Broken Grades. In this relatively short book, O'Connor makes a number of suggestions for relatively small changes, such as lowering the impact of homework on grades, eliminating grade-based punishments for late or missing work, and the elimination of extra credit. These are all things that teachers can do to increase the validity of their grades within their own classroom. Curriculum is a term with varying degrees of interpretation. While some may limit curriculum to a narrow definition including instructional materials, programs, and objectives, others have defined it in a much broader sense, often including the whole of the student's educational experience. The culmination of that experience is often represented with the report card grade. It is therefore essential that educators ensure that these permanent final judgments contain accurate and clearly communicated information.